It was a chilly autumn evening in 2001, and Sarah was driving home from her job at a small diner on the outskirts of town. The sky had turned a deep indigo, with the moon casting an eerie glow over the quiet, deserted road. Sarah enjoyed these solitary drives. They gave her time to decompress after a long day. But tonight, the darkness felt heavier, as if something sinister lurked just out of sight. As she drove along the winding country road, her headlights cut through the fog that had begun to settle. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the mist. It was a young woman, her thumb extended in a classic hitchhiker pose. She wore a simple white dress that fluttered slightly in the breeze. Against her better judgment, Sarah slowed down and rolled down her window. "Need a ride?" she called out, trying to sound friendly despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. The woman nodded, her eyes wide and desperate. "Please. Thank you so much," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She climbed into the passenger seat, her movements quick and anxious. Sarah noticed how cold the woman felt as she brushed against her arm. "Where are you headed?" she asked, trying to make conversation. "Just a little further up the road," the woman replied, staring straight ahead. They drove in silence, the tension in the car almost palpable. Sarah stole glances at her passenger, noticing how pale she was, almost ghostly. The woman's eyes were fixed on the road, her hands gripping the seat tightly. Something about her seemed off, but Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it. After about 15 minutes, the woman pointed to a small, dilapidated house just off the road. "You can drop me off here," she said, her voice shaky. Sarah pulled over and watched as the woman got out of the car. She stood by the side of the road for a moment, then turned to Sarah. "Thank you," she said, a strange, sad smile on her lips. Before Sarah could respond, the woman turned and walked towards the house. Sarah waited until she disappeared inside before driving away. As she continued down the road, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A few miles later, curiosity got the better of her. She turned the car around and headed back to the house. When she arrived, the place was dark and looked even more abandoned than before. She decided to knock on the door, just to make sure the woman was okay. An elderly man answered, his expression weary and suspicious. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Yes, I just gave a young woman a ride here. I wanted to make sure she got in safely," Sarah explained. The man's face paled. "You must be mistaken. No one lives here but me," he said, his voice trembling. "But I just saw her go inside," Sarah insisted. The man shook his head. "My daughter used to live here, but she died in a car accident on this very road 20 years ago. People around here sometimes claim they see her hitchhiking, but it's just a story." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "No, I saw her. I talked to her," she protested, her voice shaking. The man sighed and stepped aside, inviting her in. "See for yourself," he said. Sarah walked through the house, her heart pounding. It was clear no one had lived there for a long time. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners. She felt a growing sense of dread as she made her way to the back of the house, where she found a small, dusty room. On the wall was a framed photograph of the young woman she had given a ride. She was smiling, her eyes bright and full of life. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. She had given a ride to a ghost. The man stood in the doorway, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You're not the first to see her," he said quietly. "And you won't be the last." Sarah left the house, her mind racing. As she drove home, the image of the woman's sad smile haunted her. She never spoke of the encounter again, but she couldn't forget the chilling truth. Some spirits never find peace, and some roads are haunted by more than just memories. It was a clear summer night in 1995 when Jake, an avid camper and nature enthusiast, decided to spend the weekend in the dense forests of northern Wisconsin. He loved the solitude and tranquility of the woods, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. He set up his tent at his favorite spot, a secluded clearing near a small, babbling brook. As night fell, Jake built a small campfire and settled in, enjoying the warmth and the comforting crackle of burning wood. He gazed up at the starry sky, feeling at peace. But as the fire began to die down and the darkness closed in, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He brushed it off as paranoia. The woods could play tricks on your mind when you were alone. Jake decided to call it a night and retreated to his tent, zipping himself inside his sleeping bag. He closed his eyes, listening to the gentle flow of the brook and the hooting of an owl somewhere in the distance. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard a noise, a twig snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. He lay still, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, approaching his tent. Jake reached for his flashlight, his hand trembling. He clicked it on and pointed it towards the sound, but the thin beam of light revealed nothing but trees and shadows. "Who's there?" Jake called out, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no answer. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence was deafening. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. An animal, another camper, or something far more sinister. After a few minutes of tense silence, Jake convinced himself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. He turned off the flashlight and lay back down, but sleep eluded him. Every rustle, every creak of the forest seemed amplified, feeding his growing unease. Just as he was about to drift off again, he heard a whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He sat up, listening intently. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and it sounded like his name. Jake. His blood ran cold. He fumbled for the flashlight, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He shone the light around the tent, but saw nothing. Panic set in. He knew he wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there. Gathering his courage, Jake unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the flashlight's beam cutting through the inky blackness. "Who's there?" he called out again, his voice echoing through the trees. Silence. He took a few cautious steps towards the edge of the clearing, his senses on high alert. Then he saw it, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight, barely visible among the trees. It was tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. "Jake!" The whisper came again, but the figure didn't move. Jake's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He managed to take a step back, then another, never taking his eyes off the figure. Suddenly, the figure darted forward, moving with unnatural speed. Jake turned and bolted towards his car, parked a short distance away. He could hear the footsteps behind him, gaining ground. He didn't dare look back. He reached the car and fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely insert them into the lock. He finally managed to unlock the door and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. He started the engine and sped away, his heart pounding in his ears. As he drove, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him leave. Its glowing eyes were the last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed it up. Jake never returned to that campsite. The memory of that night haunted him, a chilling reminder of the unseen dangers that lurk in the woods. He couldn't explain what he had seen or heard, but one thing was certain: he was never truly alone in those woods. It was a foggy winter night in 2010 when Emily found herself driving down the lonely stretch of Highway 23. She had been visiting friends in a neighboring town and had lost track of time, leaving much later than she had planned. The road was empty, shrouded in a thick blanket of fog that seemed to swallow the headlights of her car. Emily was used to driving at night, but something about this particular evening felt off. The dense fog limited her visibility, forcing her to drive slower than usual. The radio played softly in the background, but it did little to calm her growing unease. As she navigated a particularly winding section of the highway, Emily noticed a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but as she drew closer, the figure became clearer. A young man, his thumb extended in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. Emily's first instinct was to keep driving. The fog and the late hour made the idea of picking up a hitchhiker feel inherently risky. But something about the man's desperate expression tugged at her heart. She slowed down and rolled down her window. "Need a ride?" she called out, her voice barely carrying through the mist. The man nodded, his eyes wide with relief. "Thank you so much," he said as he climbed into the passenger seat. He was young, probably in his early 20s, and wore a thin jacket that seemed inadequate for the cold. "Where are you headed?" Emily asked as she resumed driving. "Just a bit further up the road," he replied, his voice tinged with exhaustion. They drove in silence for a few minutes. Emily couldn't help but glance over at her passenger, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the worn look of his clothes. She wanted to ask more about him, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, the man spoke. "I really appreciate you picking me up," he said. "Most people wouldn't stop, especially on a night like this." Emily forced a smile. "It's no problem. I've been in your shoes before. Everyone needs a little help now and then." The man nodded, his gaze distant. "You have no idea how much this means to me." As they continued down the foggy highway, Emily noticed the temperature inside the car seemed to drop. She shivered, glancing at the man again. He was staring out the window, a haunted look in his eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He turned to her, his expression somber. "I've been trying to get home for a long time." There was something in his tone that sent a chill down Emily's spine. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded and kept her eyes on the road. After a few more miles, the man pointed to an old, decrepit house just off the highway. "Here is fine," he said. Emily pulled over and watched as he got out of the car. He turned back to her, a sad smile on his face. "Thank you again," he said softly. Before Emily could reply, he walked towards the house and disappeared into the fog. She sat there for a moment, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over her. Finally, she put the car in gear and drove away, eager to put the strange encounter behind her. The next day, curiosity got the better of her. Emily decided to visit the house in daylight. As she approached, she noticed how run down it looked, with broken windows and an overgrown yard. An old man was sitting on the porch, and she decided to ask him about the hitchhiker. "Excuse me," she called out. "I gave a ride to a young man last night who said he lived here. Do you know him?" The old man's face turned pale. "What did he look like?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emily described the hitchhiker, and the old man shook his head slowly. "That's my son. He died on this highway 5 years ago in a car accident. People say his spirit still haunts these roads, trying to find his way home." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "But I saw him. I talked to him." The old man sighed. "You're not the first to say that. His spirit must still be searching for peace." Emily left the house, her mind racing. The foggy night, the chilling cold, the haunted look in the hitchhiker's eyes, it all made sense now. she had encountered a ghost, a restless soul trapped in an endless search for home. From that night on, Emily never drove down Highway 23 without thinking of the lost hitchhiker, a reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. If you want to see more horror stories, check out my next video.